And then taking it one step further, James, is this whole concept of digital freedom of speech. And so when YouTube tells me I can't say things, and it started off because I had a guest that was questioning some of the aspects of COVID-19, was questioning the tests, the false positive, the false negative, was questioning perhaps the effect that 5G would have on the immune system. And Lord, God forbid we start talking about vaccines, it's all gets shut down. And so, but again, it was just literally a guy in a leather chair who was 68 years old talking. We did not advocate violence, the overthrow of governments, anything of that sort. It was a conversation, and yet it violated community policy. And I opined before Black Lives Matter that if we had had the same discussion in, 1860, and I was talking about how perhaps, slavery was the wrong thing to do, that very possibly the community standards of YouTube at that time would have been against that, and I would have been banned. So it's like you need these discussions, like you said, to maybe, to do the right things.
Right.
The progression we've seen over the last few hundred years has been because of freedom of speech.
Right, because wrong views can be aired, thus become known, thus can be challenged. So it's very important with something like, say, COVID-19, or with climate change as another example, or with issues around race and racism as another actually very good example. It's very important that we're able to have the discussions around these issues. It's very important that we are able to do so in a way that leads us toward finding out what's true. And if there's no challenge to a belief, very few people understand how we find out what's true. Very few people have the scientific training or chops to understand how difficult it is, as I once read, to prize diamonds of truth out of the firmament of the universe. It is, which is funny because it's an anti-scientific statement, but it's a beautiful metaphor anyway. There's no firmament out there, kids. But it is very difficult. So the way that we find truth is called epistemology in general, and it has basically two steps. You have to have a means of forwarding propositions that are reasonable, or really they don't have to be, but in general you want to have a means of forwarding propositions that will be taken seriously, and then you have a means of cutting down propositions that are incorrect. And so in the sciences, where we actually have demonstrably found large amounts of provisionally true statements about the universe, meaning statements that we can call true because if we place bets on them, we'll usually win those bets. And in fact, very reliably win those bets. If I wanted to say, if I were in the military and I wanted to shoot a piece of artillery, 40 miles and have it land on something the size of a Volkswagen, I could bet with an extraordinary level of confidence, just from Newtonian mechanics, that's going to give me an accurate shot, and therefore that I'm speaking about something real in the world. So you have to be able to forward ideas through usually some kind of a theory that's well-founded and well-grounded. There's, various pieces to that, but then you have to be able to cut down false ideas. You have to be able to see where they're wrong. You have to be able to falsify, or in science, or defeat in philosophy, ideas that have gone wrong. And that process requires checking. That requires looking at counter views. It requires saying, oh, wow, maybe I didn't think of that. And maybe we should actually take a look at that and find out. And to do the experiment if it's science, or to entertain counter arguments if it's a philosophical kind of thing or a political kind of thing. That's absolutely required. With the ideology that we're now seeing mainlining in the West, this woke ideology, you don't actually use these mechanisms anymore. You don't use let's forward ideas from, epistemically adequate theory. Let's no longer worry about that. We're now going to forward propositions using lived experience. My own personal interpretation of why I think what's happening to me is happening to me. Anybody who's ever had a stomach ache can tell you right now that lived experience very rarely tells you the relevant information. You know that you have a stomach ache, but you typically have no idea why you had a stomach ache. You don't know if you need to take antacids. You don't know if you need to go to the bathroom. You don't know what the problem is until nature takes its course and you figure it out, for example. And I mean, the examples of lived experience being a bad barometer are copious. Then you need to have a tool to cut it back. And what they use is problematizing. Could it offend somebody? Could this idea offend somebody rather than is it true? That becomes the primary standard. Is this idea politically useful for our goals? that becomes the standard by which they cut ideas down. So the people don't understand how to know what's true. And they've replaced it with this terrible methodology that really just enshrines offense as a knowledge generating, if you will, tool. And so because they don't understand how to know what's true, they don't understand why it's so vital that people are able to forward the counter argument. I've made the argument many times, for example, that I think that university economics departments, I think, a fairly reasonable person who believes in a capitalist system as far as the best workings of the economy, but I would definitely not be like an anarcho-capitalist or a far libertarian laissez-faire capitalist or something like that. But I think that economics departments, for this reason, necessarily would need somebody like an ANCAP. They would necessarily also need a communist, an outright Marxist. And the debates should be happening where students can hear the variety of views and thus winnow out a clearer understanding of economics, clearer understanding of how the world works, to see the best arguments from each side up against each other, and to come away more informed from those debates. It's a very paternalistic way of thinking. In fact, it flatly believes that most people are stupid to think that you have to control what they're able to hear so that they don't believe the wrong stuff.